In the ancient courts of power, few names carry the weight of both promise and tragedy, like that of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, whose rise to kingship began not in a palace, but in the dusty construction sites of a mighty empire. This was a leader handpicked by divine decree, entrusted with reshaping a nation's destiny, yet whose legacy would become synonymous with the very corruption he was meant to prevent. His story unfolds in the turbulent final years of a united kingdom, when the weight of heavy taxation and forced labor had pushed an entire people to the breaking point. Here stood a man of remarkable capability, whose administrative genius had caught the attention of the wisest king in Israel's history, yet who would face a choice that would echo through centuries, a choice between trusting divine promises or grasping for human security. Through the voice of a prophet, the Almighty had spoken words that should have brought unshakable confidence, a kingdom promised, a dynasty offered, a covenant sealed with the same conditions that had blessed the greatest king before him. The terms were crystal clear: walk in divine ways, keep the statutes, follow the path of righteousness, and receive a throne that would endure through generations. This was not merely political maneuvering or human ambition. This was divine election, the hand of providence placing a capable servant into the machinery of destiny. The kingdom had reached a crossroads that would determine not just political boundaries, but the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. For decades, the burden of building projects and military campaigns had drained the people's resources and crushed their spirits under the weight of corvée labor and crushing taxation. The magnificent temple and palace complexes, the far-reaching trade networks, the impressive military fortifications, all of these achievements had come at a cost that the common people could no longer bear. Murmurs of discontent rippled through villages and towns. Whispered conversations in marketplaces spoke of relief, of change, of a different kind of leadership that might understand their struggles and ease their burdens. Hope and divine calling, how the Almighty raises leaders from humble beginnings, placing them in positions where their character will be tested and their true nature revealed. The pattern repeats throughout history: the servant elevated to rule, the worker promoted to leadership, the one who understands struggle given the power to alleviate it. Yet with such elevation comes the greatest of all tests. Will the newly powerful remember their humble origins and the divine source of their authority, or will they succumb to the intoxicating nature of control and the fear of losing what they have been given? This man's story begins in promise, but carries within it the seeds of a cautionary tale that speaks to every generation about the nature of trust, the seduction of control, and the price of choosing human wisdom over divine faithfulness. In the administrative quarters of a great king's construction projects, where the sound of hammers and chisels filled the air and the dust of ambitious buildings settled on everything, there emerged a leader whose competence could not be ignored. His organizational skills, his ability to motivate workers, his keen understanding of logistics and human nature, all of these qualities marked him as exceptional among his peers. When the king himself took notice, it was not merely because of political connections or family lineage, but because of demonstrated ability and proven results. This was merit rising to meet opportunity, talent being recognized and rewarded by the highest authority in the land. The prophetic encounter that would change everything came not in the marble halls of power, but on a dusty road, in a moment that seemed ordinary, yet carried extraordinary weight. The symbolism was unmistakable. A new garment torn into 12 pieces, 10 given as a tangible sign of kingdoms to come, 2 retained as a reminder of divine faithfulness to ancient promises. This was not political revolution or human scheming. This was divine redistribution, the Almighty reshaping the boundaries of power according to His own purposes and timeline. The conditions attached to this incredible promise revealed the heart of divine governance. Righteousness as the foundation of lasting authority, obedience as the source of dynastic stability, faithfulness as the key to generational blessing. These were not arbitrary religious requirements imposed upon political reality. They were the fundamental principles upon which sustainable leadership must be built. The offer was extraordinary in its scope, not just temporary authority but lasting dynasty. Not just political power but divine partnership. Not just human achievement but cosmic significance in the unfolding plan of providence. The moment of transition arrived with the fury of a people whose patience had finally shattered against the wall of uncompromising arrogance, when the question of relief from crushing burdens was met not with understanding but with promises of even greater severity. The reaction was swift and decisive. The ancient cry of independence that had once rallied tribes against foreign oppression now echoed through the land, as 10 tribes rejected the dynasty that had ruled them for generations. Standing at the threshold of fulfilled prophecy, King Jeroboam found himself master of a realm that exceeded even his boldest dreams, yet immediately confronted by a fear that would prove more dangerous than any external enemy. What if my people's hearts turn back to what they once knew? What if their religious obligations become the pathway to political betrayal? This was the moment when divine promise collided with human insecurity, when trust in providential protection was challenged by the pragmatic calculations of political survival. The covenant had been clear and unambiguous. Faithfulness would secure the throne, obedience would establish the dynasty, trust in divine protection would prove more reliable than any human scheme. Yet fear has a way of drowning out even the clearest divine voices, and insecurity can make the most explicit promises seem uncertain and conditional. Here was a leader who had witnessed divine power in his elevation to the throne, who had seen prophecy fulfilled in the most dramatic political upheaval in generations, yet who now questioned whether that same divine power could protect him from the perceived threat of his people's religious loyalties. The geographical and religious realities of the divided kingdom created what seemed like an impossible dilemma for any ruler concerned with maintaining political control. The central sanctuary, the focal point of national religious life, the place where the great festivals drew pilgrims from across the land, all of this remained in territory now controlled by a rival dynasty. 3 times each year, the religious calendar would call the faithful to journey to that sacred place, creating regular opportunities for contact between the northern tribes and the southern capital. From a purely human perspective, this appeared to be a fatal flaw in the political arrangement, a structural weakness that would inevitably undermine northern independence and draw the people back toward their former allegiance. Fear versus trust. When leaders grasp for control rather than rest in divine promises, when insecurity overwhelms faith and human wisdom appears more reliable than divine faithfulness. This tension appears in every generation and every context, where authority must choose between manipulation and trust, between control and confidence in a higher power. The leader who has received everything through divine grace, yet fears losing it through divine inadequacy, reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of both divine character and the nature of true security. Such fear becomes self-fulfilling prophecy, as the very attempts to secure human control often destroy the divine protection that would have provided perfect security. The irony runs deep. The leader elevated by divine power begins to doubt that same power's ability to sustain what it has created. The king who had experienced firsthand the faithfulness of divine promises now questioned whether those promises could be trusted in the face of practical political challenges. This was not merely a crisis of confidence, but a fundamental theological error, the assumption that divine purposes could be thwarted by human choices, that divine plans required human manipulation to succeed, that divine protection was insufficient for the challenges ahead. In the counsels of his advisors, in the quiet moments of personal reflection, in the sleepless nights when the weight of kingship pressed most heavily upon his consciousness, the questions multiplied, and the fears intensified. Every religious festival became a potential political crisis, every pilgrimage a possible defection, every act of worship a threat to national loyalty. The very religious devotion that should have been seen as a strength of his people, their faithfulness to divine commands, their commitment to sacred traditions, their unwillingness to compromise their spiritual obligations for political convenience, became in his mind the greatest weakness of his kingdom and the most serious threat to his continued rule. The progression from trust to fear, from confidence to insecurity, from divine reliance to human manipulation, played out in the private chambers of power, where advisors whispered concerns, and strategic calculations overwhelmed spiritual convictions. Gratitude and faith now found himself paralyzed by scenarios of political disaster and dynastic collapse. What began as reasonable concern for maintaining stable governance evolved into obsessive fear of losing control, and what started as strategic thinking about political challenges became a fundamental rejection of the divine protection that had brought him to power in the first place. In a moment that would echo the greatest spiritual disaster in his nation's history, King Jeroboam made a decision that transformed religious devotion into political manipulation and sacred worship into dynastic security. The creation of two golden figures, placed strategically at the northern and southern boundaries of his realm, represented more than alternative worship sites. They embodied the fundamental corruption that occurs when divine truth is subordinated to human control. This was not merely a practical accommodation to geographical challenges or a reasonable compromise with political realities. This was a conscious choice to reshape divine truth according to human needs, to modify sacred traditions for political convenience, to prioritize dynastic security over religious integrity. The words that accompanied this innovation carried deliberate echoes of ancient rebellion. Here are your gods who brought you up from the land of slavery. The repetition was not accidental. It was a calculated appeal to historical precedent, an attempt to legitimize present compromise by invoking past rebellion, a strategy that sought to make acceptable the unacceptable by wrapping it in familiar language and patriotic sentiment. The archaeological and historical evidence suggests that these golden figures may not have represented foreign deities, but rather alternative representations of divine presence, platforms or thrones, rather than objects of worship themselves. Yet this distinction, while historically important, missed the deeper spiritual significance of what was taking place. Even if the intention was to worship the true divine through alternative symbols, the very act of creating unauthorized representations violated the fundamental principle of divine sovereignty over the forms and methods of worship. This was the corruption of true religion from within, rather than its replacement from without, a more subtle and therefore more dangerous form of spiritual rebellion. The establishment of alternative worship centers required more than just the creation of symbolic objects. It demanded the complete reconstruction of religious infrastructure throughout the kingdom. Priests had to be appointed from outside the traditional sacred lineage. Sacred festivals had to be rescheduled to avoid conflicts with the traditional religious calendar. New traditions had to be created to replace ancient practices. And an entire alternative religious system had to be established to support the political goals of the monarchy. This was not a simple modification of existing practices, but a comprehensive religious revolution designed to serve political ends rather than divine purposes. Betrayal. How fear-driven compromise corrodes faith and misleads others. How the desire for control transforms those meant to serve divine purposes into agents of spiritual destruction. The pattern is depressingly familiar across history and cultures. Leaders elevated by divine grace who become convinced that divine methods are insufficient for divine purposes, who begin to modify divine truth to serve human goals, who gradually transform from servants of transcendent reality into manipulators of sacred tradition for political gain. Such betrayal is particularly tragic because it often begins with good intentions, the desire to preserve and protect what is precious, but ends with the destruction of the very thing it sought to save. The king who had once been the recipient of divine favor now became its opponent, not through conscious rebellion against divine authority, but through the gradual substitution of human wisdom for divine guidance. The man who had received his kingdom through prophetic promise now sought to maintain it through prophetic contradiction. The leader who had been chosen specifically to provide an alternative to corrupt leadership now found himself creating new forms of corruption that would prove even more destructive than what had come before. In the mountain shrines and alternative sacred sites that proliferated throughout his realm, in the festivals and ceremonies that mimicked but modified traditional worship, in the priests and ritual practices that served political rather than spiritual purposes, the comprehensive nature of this religious transformation became evident. The worship system established for short-term political convenience became the foundation for centuries of spiritual corruption that would ultimately contribute to national disaster and exile. What seemed like successful political strategy in the immediate term proved to be catastrophic spiritual failure with generational consequences. Justice and betrayal. The cost of trading divine promises for self-preservation, the inevitable consequences of choosing human control over divine faithfulness. The pattern of divine justice operates on a timeline that often exceeds human understanding, with consequences unfolding over generations rather than immediate seasons. The king who thought he had successfully solved his political problems through religious innovation had actually created spiritual problems that would plague his nation for centuries. The man who feared losing his kingdom through trust in divine promises actually lost his dynasty through distrust of divine faithfulness. The leader who sought security through human control discovered that such security was ultimately illusory, while the divine protection he had rejected would have provided the lasting stability he desperately desired. The final irony of this story lies in its demonstration that fear of consequences often produces the very consequences that were feared. The king who worried that his people's religious loyalties would undermine his political authority created religious alternatives that ultimately undermined his spiritual authority, and, through that corruption, destroyed the very dynasty he had sought to preserve. The man who received his kingdom through divine intervention lost his legacy through divine judgment, not because divine mercy was insufficient, but because divine truth was non-negotiable. In the archaeological remains of worship sites scattered throughout the ancient kingdom, in the historical records that trace the spiritual decline of subsequent generations, in the prophetic literature that chronicles the long path toward national catastrophe, the evidence accumulates of choices made in royal chambers that echoed through centuries of national life. The king's fear-driven decisions created institutional momentum toward spiritual corruption that proved almost impossible to reverse, demonstrating how individual choices by those in authority can create cultural trajectories that extend far beyond their personal influence or immediate consequences. The tragedy is compounded by the recognition that none of this was necessary. The divine promises were sufficient, the divine protection was adequate, the divine plan was comprehensive enough to handle every challenge the king thought required human manipulation. The story serves not merely as historical record, but as perpetual warning about the seductive nature of control, the deceptive appeal of human wisdom, and the hidden costs of replacing divine trust with human schemes. This ancient tale of promise corrupted by fear, of divine calling betrayed by human insecurity, of spiritual authority sacrificed for political control, asks each of us the most fundamental questions about the nature of trust and the source of true security. Jeroboam's story is not just ancient history. It asks each of us, do we cling to control out of fear, or trust divine promises even when surrender feels risky?